Okie dokie. So let's get the show on the road, and the screen will for those who are here who are present will the screen will clear momentarily. We're going to be discussing Shemaya and Avtalyon. Shemaya and Avtalyon, as we're going to be discussing, were the rabbis. They were the Tanoim. They were the Jewish leaders, or the rabbinic leadership, anyways, during the end of the Hasmonean era. This was a very, very tumultuous period in Jewish history, and it also, with the conclusion of the Hasmonean era, it bears mentioning and it just bears discussing Hanukkah, how it's perceived, how it was viewed in the days of the Chashmonoim, the days of the Hasmoneans, and perhaps what that means for us today who no longer live in the Hasmonean era. But we're going to start right away with, I'm going to move this out of the way, we're going to start, as we normally do, with a Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, from Maseches Avos. This is how we usually start. And here we are introduced in the very beginning of the very first chapter. We have this transmission of authorities from Moshe all the way down through the Zukim, then to the earliest Tanoim. Let me just admit these folks here. And we are going to begin with this Mishnah here. Shemaya and Avtalyon received from them. And, as we've been discussing, we've been speaking about all of these rabbis who existed during the time of the Chashmonoim, from the times of the Hasmoneans. We spoke about Yossi ben Yoezer, Nitai Ho'arbeli. We spoke about Shimon ben Shetach last week. Here we have Shemaya and Avtalyon. They received their Torah education, their learning, their tradition from the aforementioned rabbinic authorities. Shemaya used to say, "Love labor, loathe mastery over others, and do not seek familiarity with ruling authorities." It was pretty busy. Okay. Okay. All right. He would seek don't seek familiarity with ruling authorities. You can already see there's this very much this individualistic, anti-establishment, anti-government air to their teachings. And it was Avtalyon would say, "Scholars, be very careful with your words, for you may be exiled to a place inhabited by evil elements who will destroy your words to suit their negative purposes. You'll have disciples who will come after you. Then they will drink the evil waters of the people who surround you, who are awful, and the name of heaven will be desecrated." So we hear again right away, we start off with Shemaya and Avtalyon, and they're saying some pretty deep things and some rather disconcerting things about that perhaps reflect on the world they lived in. So let's talk about their historical context. So we previously, when we spoke about the previous list of rabbis, we discussed who were they? Shimon ben Shetach and Yehuda ben Tabai. They lived during the period right about over here, during the time of Alexander Yanai and his queen, Alexandria, or she was also known as Shlom Tzion, at least within rabbinic literature. And they reigned, both of them together, when it wasn't one, it was the other, from approximately the year 100 BCE until the year 67 BCE. The successors of the rabbis, who were the contemporaries of Alexander Yanai and Shlom Tzion, were these topics the rabbis were discussing tonight, Shemaya and Avtalyon. They were active during, as was mentioned, a particularly turbulent period for the Jews who lived in Eretz Yisrael. So let's talk about what was going on, and let me move this out of the way. What was happening, what was going on? Queen Shlom Tzion had success in maintaining good relationships on the international front. She was able to hold things together in the internal front. And when she passed away, her son, who is this guy right over here, Hyrcanus II, was essentially crowned as the successor. He was appointed both as the high priest as well as the subsequent king. However, as was typical of the time, he had siblings, and further, as was typical of the time, siblings who were not crowned as king often still wanted to have that authority, that role. And so Aristobulus, Hyrcanus's younger brother, decided to foment a rebellion and overthrow his brother. And he was successful. After a very brief battle, Aristobulus was able to seize control. Hyrcanus surrendered, but while he was down, he was not out. Assisted by his friend Antipater, who was the father of Herod, who was the minister of war, who was an Idumean slave at the same time, they were able to enlist the aid of the king of Idumea, of Edom, and together they besieged the house in which Aristobulus and his soldiers were fortified. And it's the context of this that we actually read a fascinating story from Josephus. This is Josephus here, famous Jewish historian from the first century of the Common Era. He wrote in Greek, perhaps in Latin as well. He was Jewish. He was the head of some rebellion, the Jewish rebellion in the Galilee. He surrendered to Vespasian, and he, for one reason or another, Vespasian liked him, and he was kept around to be Vespasian's official historian. And he records here the story of Choni HaMe'agel. Choni HaMe'agel. Choni HaMe'agel is referenced in the Gemara as being a very unique individual. This was someone who was something of a mystic, something of a pietist. There's a story that the Gemara tells about how there was a drought, and Choni HaMe'agel, her surname there, HaMe'agel means the one who draws circles. He drew a circle in the ground. He stepped inside the circle during the time of a drought and said, Hashem, I'm not leaving the circle until you bring rain. Rain came down. It wasn't hard enough. He said, no, God, I wanted better rain. The rain came down too hard. He said, no, God, I want the right kind of rain. The right kind of rain came down, and then finally he left his circle. So he's known in the Gemara as being a particularly interesting individual. He got into a bit of a scrap with Shimon ben Shetach. Shimon ben Shetach wanted to excommunicate him, as Shimon ben Shetach was the hero of last week's class, but he couldn't because it was Choni HaMe'agel. He's just somebody who God loves so much, you can't say or do anything against them. But here you have Josephus actually talking about that same Choni HaMe'agel, referencing that story as found in the Talmud, as found in the Gemara. So this is what he says. There was a certain Chonio who was a righteous man and dear to God. Once in a time of drought, he prayed to God to end the drought. God heard his prayer, and he sent the rain. The same story that the Gemara tells. This man hid himself when he saw that the civil war continued to rage. But he was eventually found. He was taken to the camp of the Jews, and he was asked to put a curse on Aristobulus. So Aristobulus, if you remember, was Hyrcanus' younger brother who seized control, overthrew Hyrcanus. But now Hyrcanus has allied himself with Antipater and the king of Idumea, and now they're besieging Aristobulus, and they want Choni to curse Aristobulus so that he would die and they won't have to fight the battle anymore. But he refused. Finally, he was forced to speak by the mob. He stood up in their midst and said, "O God, King of the universe," and I just lost this. All right, sorry about that. "O God, King of the universe, since these men standing beside me are your people, and those who are besieged are your priests, I beseech you, do not hearken to these against those and those against these. Don't listen to anyone. Don't listen to any prayers that these people might have that their competition might expire, and vice versa. Just don't listen to anything anyone has to say over here." When he had prayed in this manner, the villains among the Jews who stood around him stoned him to death. So this is the story of the death of Choni HaMe'agel, at least as it's reported in Josephus. The Gemara has a different story about how Choni HaMe'agel dies. But this is a fascinating story. And the story here, again, is about this civil war that broke out between Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. So this is a civil war between brothers. And to be fair, this probably eradicated the last vestiges of sanctity that remained in the temple since the time of the purification of their great-grandfather, Shimon, and their great-great-uncle, Yehuda, 100 years earlier. The Gemara also records a fascinating story about what was transpiring at this time. So you have this siege of Jerusalem. Aristobulus is on the Temple Mount, and Hyrcanus has him surrounded with his Idumean forces. And meanwhile, there were the priests in the Beis Hamikdash, the Kohanim, who were attempting to, offer the sacrifices as you would. So our rabbis taught. This is again a Gemara from Masechah Soto. When the king of the Hasmonean houses fought one another, Hyrcanus was outside and Aristobulus was inside. Each day they would let down a basket full of dinarim, a basket full of coins, and the people would take the coins and replace it with animals to be offered as part of the daily korbanos. But there was an old man there who was learned in Greek wisdom and who spoke with them in Greek. And he said, as long as they're able to carry on the temple service, they will never surrender to you. So on the next day, as the Kohanim on the Temple Mount sent down their basket full of coins, the people down below did not place an animal worthy of sacrifices. They instead placed a pig in the basket to be hauled up by the Kohanim. When it reached halfway up the wall, the Gemara tells us, it struck its hooves into the wall, and there was an earthquake. The land of Israel was shaken over a distance of 400 parsangs. And at that time, the rabbis of the day declared, "Cursed is the man who rears pigs, and cursed is the man who teaches his son Greek wisdom." There is an incredible amount of shame that's really palpable in how these events are described. This was a really, really brutal civil war that really, I guess, highlighted just how degenerate the Hasmonean kingdom had become at this point. And it was because of this civil war that this guy shows up, and he is completely unopposed, rather, excuse me. This is the Roman general Pompey. He's going through the Middle East at this time, and he is conquering country after country. He's just conquered the Seleucid Greeks in Syria, and he walks into Eretz Yisrael completely unimposed. The Jews are too busy fighting each other to pay attention that there's this strange Roman guy with a whole bunch of Roman soldiers who have just taken over their country. This is the end of the independent Jewish kingdom. The decades after 63 BCE saw a number of rulers over the land of Israel, but again, it was not an independent state. It was a subject or a client state of the Roman Empire. The first person of prominence who rose to power after the Romans took control of the country was Antipater, our friend, the slave of Hyrcanus II, the Idumean, and who now was appointed under Pompey and then subsequently under Julius Caesar as the governor of Judea. He was very well regarded by Julius Caesar, and he was conferred the title ruler of the land of Israel, as well as granted Roman citizenship as a show of affection and respect and patronage by Julius Caesar. And as the governor, he was then able to appoint his own children as sub-governors or governors in their own right over the various provinces of Judea. His son Faisal became the governor in Jerusalem, and his son Herod became the governor in the Galilee. So about 10 years after this, so this is the year about 45 BCE, Aristobulus' son, so remember it's this guy, the upstart, who overthrew his brother Hyrcanus II, his son Antigonus, or Matisyahu Antigonus, was able to declare war. He was able to gather enough support. He declared war against Faisal in Jerusalem. He attempted to usurp the authority of Antipater, and he had his uncle, who was still serving as Kohen Gadol, had him disqualified by cutting off his ears. He was so successful in his attempts to completely root out Antipater and his family that Herod had to run away to Rome, where the Senate greeted him and conferred upon him the title King of the Jews, where he was then able to return about 10 years after this. And in about the year 37 BCE, Herod was able to establish himself as the king of Judea. So you have a lot of back and forth. You have the sort of the last vestige of the Hasmonean house attempting to maintain control, fighting against this Idumean family that will become a lineage, will become a dynasty in their own right. And it's during this period, it's during this time that we have Shemaya and Avtalyon as the rabbinic leadership of the day. And Josephus actually speaks about these two also. These two people do show up in the secular histories of the time likewise. Josephus refers to this pair as Samius and Polyon, and also says that they were treated rather well. Antipater and Herod actually respected them quite a bit. They were given free rein to be the rabbis they wanted to be and do the things that they thought they wanted to do. And at the same time, as is obvious from the Mishnah that we started off with, they show an incredible distrust of government, or at the very least, a desire to completely sequester themselves away from government. Let's talk about their statement that says, don't seek familiarity with the ruling authorities. This is absolutely clear. At the height of a civil war, nonpartisanship is probably the best policy. Siding with either policy could undermine you in the best of circumstances, and under normal circumstances will probably cost you your life. So these rabbis instructed their students to take a step backwards and not become involved in politics or the government. After many years of the Hasmonean state, which was in decline by this point, which was characterized by a corrupt and Hellenized bureaucracy, the call to love labor and hate mastery was probably very, very welcome. The call to return to a life of work and labor reflects a disenchantment with the failed Jewish state. Power had corrupted its values and undermined the foundations of the society. And Shemaya and Avtalyon's condemnation of political authority was sweeping, and it really addressed itself to all people who held positions of power, positions of authority. This is now where we can perhaps start talking about who Shemaya and Avtalyon were. They were individuals with questionable ancestry. What do we mean? Let's see. Let's show. If you took the opportunity on Yom Kippur during a period of time during Musaf, during the Chazan's repetition, there's a very fascinating part of the service that we call the avoda, or the temple service, where we really sort of describe in poetic form the service, on Yom Kippur as it was conducted in the temple. And we have this incredibly laudatory description of the Kohen Gadol as he leaves the Holy of Holies, and how he would be accompanied by throngs of admirers. That's what's happening here in this Gemara. This is in Maseches Yuma, describing the Kohen Gadol of the day leaving the sanctuary and having throngs of people surround him, only for them to see Shemaya and Avtalyon and completely abandon the Kohen Gadol to go show their admiration and love for these two rabbis. Let's read what it says. It says, it happened that a high priest once came out of the sanctuary, and the people followed him. But when they saw Shemaya and Avtalyon, they forsook him and went after Shemaya and Avtalyon. But while they were walking along the same direction, it wasn't such a big deal because the throngs were walking along with the Kohen Gadol, even if their focus was not on the Kohen Gadol any longer. But eventually it reached the time for Shemaya and Avtalyon to turn to the right while the priest would keep on walking. But the priest was outraged. He was angry about this breach in decorum and this lack of, respect for the established order. And he said to Shemaya and Avtalyon, may the descendants of heathens who do the work of Aharon, I'm sorry, I skipped a line. May the descendants of the heathen come in peace, or may they go in peace. We say shalom in Hebrew for both as a greeting and as a wish at departure. So the translation here perhaps is a bit wonky, or it's a bit clunky, but he was essentially saying, go in peace, you descendants of non-Jews. And they respond back to him in turn about how the descendants of Aaron, who does not do the work of Aharon, shall not be granted peace. So they threw their barbs back at this Kohen Gadol, who was questioning their pedigree. And he wasn't the only person. This isn't the only source in which we find that they're referred to as individuals who were the descendants of converts. We also find, for example, the Gemara tells us in Maseches Gittin, when talking about descendants of notable wicked individuals like Sisra and Sancheriv. Sancheriv was the Assyrian. You have Sisra, who was was for the Canaanite, who led the I think Devorah had to lead Barak in battle against. Descendants of Sisra taught children in Jerusalem. Descendants of Sancheriv gave public expositions of the Torah. Who were the descendants of Sisra and Sancheriv? Shemaya and Avtalyon. And this was perhaps rather unusual, because you usually find when we talk about great rabbis of the past, rabbis of the Mishnah, at least their predecessors, they were people who were generally assumed to have regular, run-of-the-mill Jewish pedigree. But here we have a very unusual scenario, which probably raised a few eyebrows. And while the high priest's denigration of these Chachamim was vulgar and rude, and perhaps he violated the commandment of not oppressing converts, we do see, though, that he's not alone in criticism. As we'll see, a contemporary of theirs, or perhaps in a subsequent generation or two, broadly contemporaneous, Akavia ben Mahalalel, who is a very, very well-known name with the Mishnayos, also has some biting comments to make about the pedigree of Shemaya and Avtalyon. Let's take a look at this text over here. Now, this is talking about the Mei Sota. When a wife is suspected of committing adultery, the husband can bring her to the Beis HaMikdash, where she's given water to drink that has the name of Hashem dissolved into it. And, according to the Torah, if she had committed adultery, she would die. Otherwise, she will live. but there are certain restrictions on who drinks the mesota, who is qualified as someone who can be brought to the Beis Hamikdash to drink this water. Akavia ben Mahalalel used to say that one does not give the waters to drink to a female convert or a freed Gentile female slave. However, the Chachamim say you have the Rabbanan who disagree, and they said no, they can drink. They're no different than any other Jewish woman. So they then attempted to use some jurisprudence and say, but there was this case of Karkamit, the freed female slave who was in Jerusalem, and Shemaya and Avtalyon gave her the water to drink. So this is the response of Akavia ben Mahalalel. He said to them, her own kind gave her to drink. Again, he was criticizing their lineage. The Chachamim were enraged by this incredible disrespect, and they put Akavia ben Mahalalel into cherem. He was excommunicated, and he died while in a state of excommunication. And one of the rules that this Gemara is actually discussing over there is that if someone dies in a state of excommunication, you stone their coffin, and that's what they did. They placed a stone on the grave of Akavia ben Mahalalel. Now, if you want to spend some more time, you can take a look and see. Well, the Mishnah actually disputes this. He wasn't actually excommunicated. Perhaps there's a different story here that we're confusing, but what we definitely do see over here is that the pedigree of Shemaya and Avtalyon was not necessarily contained to one or two individuals. This excommunication of Akavia ben Mahalalel really clearly indicates his disapproval of leaders who were the descendants of converts. And perhaps we can explain the context here, that this illustrates the tensions between newcomers and the establishment. You have Shemaya and Avtalyon, who were not part of the landed aristocracy, who gained incredible levels of Torah knowledge, who became the rabbinic leaders of their day in perhaps a overthrow of established order. And there was some class tension between, the patricians, the established rabbinic families, and these two upstarts who were quite obviously the most competent rabbinic minds of their day. And we do see again that criticism of Shemaya and Avtalyon's contemporaries, or at least of those who did not respect them properly, was echoed by Hillel, who is their most prominent student. The famous Hillel of the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. Shammai and Hillel were both students of Shemaya and Avtalyon. When Hillel came back from Babylon to Jerusalem, and he was asked halakhic questions, and he was installed in positions of authority because of his incredible expertise, as well as because he was able to quote flawlessly the teachings of his teachers, Shemaya and Avtalyon. The first thing that he does when appointed to a new office is criticize the Bnei Beseira for not properly respecting the Talmudic scholars of the rabbis of their day, Shemaya and Avtalyon. This is perhaps another example of the Torah being expropriated from the elite and finding its appropriate place amongst those who are prepared to devote themselves to it, even if they come from, quote unquote, the lower classes of people. So let's talk a little bit more about the school that was established by Shemaya and Avtalyon. Shemaya and Avtalyon, as I mentioned, their most renowned student was Hillel. And the Talmud Bavli actually introduces us to Hillel and also perhaps provides some more context to Shemaya and Avtalyon and the world in which they lived. This is the story, and this is actually in the context of someone who passes away and who is being judged in the heavenly court, and they're asked questions like, did you spend enough time to study Torah? And if the individual responds with, well, I had to earn a living, I had to pay the bills and provide food for my wife and family, the heavenly court will then ask, well, were you poorer than Hillel? And we see that Hillel, despite the fact that he was monetarily very, very poor, at the same time, he was very, very rich in commitment and Torah knowledge. It was told of Hillel the elder, and this again is in Maseches Yuma, that every day he used to work. He was a day laborer, and he used to work and earn one tropit, whatever value of currency this is. Half of that daily wage would be given to the guard at the study house, and the other half would be spent to meet his daily needs and his family daily needs. One day, business was bad, he didn't earn enough, and as such, he was not able to pay to gain entry into the base measures, to the house of study. So what does he do? He climbs up, sits in the window so he could listen to Shemaya and Avtalyon as they taught their class. It was told that this actually took place this time of year. It was around the Shabbos of the summer solstice. And snow fell. When the dawn rose, Shemaya and Avtalyon woke up, or perhaps they looked up from their books, and they saw that there wasn't light coming in from the window that normally shone. So one says to the other, perhaps it's cloudy outside. They go outside, they see that it is in fact not cloudy. They look in the window and they see the figure of a man. It's a man who's covered in snow. So they go up, they grab him, they bathe him, they anoint him, they kindle a fire, they break Shabbos in order to save his life. He probably was suffering from hypothermia. And they said, this is a man who was worthy that Shabbos be profaned on his behalf. So this story is written in praise of Hillel, and it's frequently taught as a way of showing his love of Torah even brought him to risk his own life. But it's also perhaps the story of the tremendous tension between worlds, the worlds of the established scholarship and those people who are not part of the worlds of established scholarship. What do we see from the story? In order to enter the study house, you have to have money. And not only do you have to have money, you have to have a lot of money. This quote over here is from Yonah Frankel. He was the professor of Agada and Midrash at Hebrew University. And this is his quote. This is his quote I took from him, where he describes this story as it's found in the Talmud. Even without being able to make an exact calculation, it's clear that half of a day laborer's daily wage for the guard is prohibitive and an unjustifiable sum. We must listen to the injustice in the sentence. It happened once that he was unable to earn sufficiently, and the guard did not permit him to enter the house of study. Who is responsible for this? We can only do justice to the story if we view it as a critique and a warning. Hillel encountered a world in which the Torah was closed off and transmitted only amongst the members of the elite. This heroic act established a new standard, expanding the opportunity and perhaps the obligation for every individual to study Torah. And we see from the Gemara how in Shemayim people will be held accountable for not studying Torah, even if they're poor, by virtue of the fact that Hillel was also poor, and somehow or other he was able to find time and the ability to study Torah. So Hillel perhaps changes the perspective of the rabbinic leadership of the day as a primary student of Shemaya and Avtalyon, who are themselves also outsiders. So Shemaya and Avtalyon, in conclusion to our understanding of who they were as people and the kinds of, in the world in which they lived, we can say that perhaps these were individuals who severed the bond between the state and Torah. Having despaired of politicians and government, they brought Torah into the yeshiva. This was part of an attempt to have an influence on the development of the spiritual world of the people and leave it specifically with the people. Their students, Hillel and Shammai, would continue this debate over the proper place for Torah in everyday life, but Hillel, as their student, perhaps expanded their message, bringing Torah study, separating it from the government and from a rule and as part of the the landed gentry, the patrician aristocracy, removing it from that world, expanding it to the entirety of the Jewish people, at the same time severing the connection between it and the government. And again, this is taking place at the conclusion of the Hasmonean state. So now that we've reached this point, it really bears mentioning that we talk about Hanukkah and its impact through the ages. How was it viewed, especially as circumstances changed, and various people with various different perspectives might bring different views and ideas, theologies behind this holiday. We've really covered the entirety of the Hasmonean period, from the time of Antiochus's after his edicts in the year 167 BCE until about the year 30 of BCE. Hanukkah plays a role throughout the entirety of this period. And if you recall, we started this series of classes before Hanukkah with an idea that we would talk about the rabbis who played a role in the life, in the world, when Hanukkah was actually a contemporary event. Let's talk about the literature of the day. The story of Hanukkah appears in a number of sources in various different versions, and first and foremost can be found in the book of the Maccabees. I'm going to steal perhaps some of Yunai's thunder, perhaps saying something a bit different than what he did. He gave a class last year on Hanukkah. We actually have it. It's on YouTube. If you wanted to find it, you can find it on my channel. But let's talk about the book of the Maccabees. These are books from the Apocrypha, and they were written by various authors in different places. And the two most important works regarding the establishment of Hanukkah can be found in the first book of the Maccabees and the second book of the Maccabees. And their retelling of the story, while historically consistent, focuses on different aspects. The first book of the Maccabees was originally written in Hebrew, and it provides a comprehensive description of the period from the edicts of Antiochus until the murder of Shimon, who was I think the brother of Yehuda Maccabee, who took over the leadership after his death. The book emphasizes the military history of the Maccabees, and it's written in a spirit of identification with the rebellion and its leaders. This is really a Jew's Jewish version of the Maccabean rebellion. The second book of the Maccabees is a markedly different book. It is a paraphrase of a much larger, more expansive work written by Jason of Cyrene. It was written in Greek. It was not written in Israel. And its primary focus is on the religious circumstances of the nation during the Maccabean revolt. It was written in order to bolster the observance of Yom Tovim, of holidays, Jewish rituals, Jewish practices. They're both broadly contemporaneous. They were written probably around the same time, probably at the conclusion towards the end of the Hasmonean era. And the nature of Hanukkah in both of these books is really quite different. In the first book of the Maccabees, it describes how Yehuda Maccabee and his followers conquered Yerushalayim, and then after their victory, they purified the temple, they reestablished the avoda, the daily service, and it celebrates the reestablishment of the temple ritual and its purification in a great big party that lasted 8 days. It describes this party that took place over 8 days. And upon completion of the celebrations, it was decided that they would celebrate this annually. So according to the first book of the Maccabees, the celebration of Hanukkah is entirely about the military victory and success, our triumphant return to Jerusalem. While the same description appears in the second book of the Maccabees, it, on the other hand, places a greater emphasis on Yom Tov. Sukkot that year had been canceled because all the Jews had been out fighting in the hills. They were unable to mark Sukkot appropriately, and so after they were able to reestablish the temple service and with its purification, they celebrated Sukkot in Kislev. It's like the forerunner of Christmas in July. It's celebrating Sukkot in lieu of the 8 days that they couldn't celebrate it in its appropriate time. They celebrated 8 days, and that's where the 8 days of Hanukkah comes from, according to the second book of the Maccabees. We also have Josephus mentioning Hanukkah in Antiquities of the Jews, where he refers to it as the Festival of Lights. He doesn't mention the lighting of candles or anything similar. He explains that the name of the festival is related to the right granted to Jews to return to the temple in order to worship God without any disturbance. Now, those are sort of extra rabbinic sources. What about the rabbinic sources? What about the Mishnayos and the Gemara? What do they say about Hanukkah? Well, the very first book that can really be perhaps regarded as a rabbinic work is this book called Megillas Tainus. It's the book of the fasts, which was written during the Second Temple period. And although for the most part it has not been preserved, we do have a portion that remains that talks about the 25th of Kislev as being a day when one is not allowed to fast, nor is it a day when one is allowed to eulogize. The only thing that the Megillas Tainus says about Hanukkah at all is that on the 25th of Kislev, you cannot fast. That's it. It's also well known that there's no tractate Hanukkah in the Mishnayos. There's no Gemara devoted exclusively to Hanukkah and its observance. There's only very, very tangential mentions of Hanukkah that we find in the Mishnah. One actually came up recently in the Daf Yomi. there is a discussion about a person who leaves a candle outside their home on the road, and a camel walks by carrying flax, and the flax catches fire. Who is responsible for the damages in this case? Well, under normal circumstances, the Mishnah says, the owner of the candle is, because he left his candle in a place where it was likely to cause damage. He was negligent. That is, the Mishnah says, except when it's on Hanukkah. When it's on Hanukkah, everyone is supposed to leave their candles outside, and as such, the camel owner was negligent for not taking proper care of his camel to ensure that his flax did not get burned. From this reference, we can deduce that there was a festival of Hanukkah. Its celebration was a normative part of Jewish practice, and we also know that they were lighting candles. But that's about it. Any mention of the Hasmonean Wars or their valor or any aspect of political independence is not part of anything the Mishnah ever describes or discusses. The Chassam Sofer actually speaks to this. The Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, who was a rabbi in 19th century Pressburg, he actually talks about this, and he says, Yehuda Hanassi, Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, was the author of the Mishnah. He was a descendant of David HaMelech, of King David. And it's largely viewed by rabbis of that time that the Hasmoneans had usurped authority from the house of David. Kohan and priests should not have been kings. It's something we discussed in some of our previous classes. And as perhaps a sign of disapproval, or perhaps even something more visceral and emotional than that, maybe feeling something personal about his own family, because Yehuda Hanassi was a descendant of King David, maybe there was something distasteful to him himself. You find that there is rarely a mention of Hanukkah anywhere in the Mishnah. So where do we find Hanukkah discussed at length in rabbinic literature? We have to turn to the Talmud Bavli. The Bavli asks, what is Hanukkah? Why do we celebrate it? And it's here for the first time that we encounter the story of the jug of oil, the candles that remained lit despite the fact that there was only oil enough to last for one day. It's an 8-day festival because the oil lasted for 8 days. This is a marked change in the view of the Yom Tov, I think. And it relates back to that discussion that we had just a moment ago, and you still have the picture on the screen, the first book of the Maccabees and the second book of the Maccabees. You have two incredibly different points of view. You have the first book of the Maccabees, which celebrates military victory. And perhaps for the generations that lived at that time, that was the primary focus of the holiday. It was about military victory. It was about independence and the reestablishment of Jewish authority over their lands. That said, we have the second book of the Maccabees that likes to bring the focus back towards God. And that's perhaps where the Talmud Bavli here is bringing this aspect of Hanukkah, this 8-day celebration, a reference to a miracle that is not about independence. It's not about victory in battle. It's not about the establishment of a Jewish monarchy. Rather, it's about our relationship with God. There was a period in time after the destruction of the temple when there was a very serious debate amongst Jews whether or not Hanukkah should be abolished. If it was celebrating the Hasmonean success and victory, well, the temple's no longer here. The Hasmoneans are gone. What are we celebrating? There was perhaps an attempt to refocus people's attention on the other aspect of Hanukkah, that it wasn't solely about military victory and independence, but also about our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this plays out in modern times as well. Throughout Jewish history, we have been able to show an incredible strength of character, bravery, and spiritual resolve in our insistence on maintaining our Jewish identity, performing the mitzvos, and lighting those Hanukkah candles through the millennia in the privacy of our own homes. We've really been focusing on this aspect that connects us to God. We've not had the opportunity to show bravery in battle, but that really has changed. With the return to the land of Israel, the Zionist movement really brought the Hasmoneans back into national awareness. And secular Zionists began singing songs of praise of the Maccabees and their valor that also speak about the fact that we had no miracle and there was no cruise of oil. Bialik writes a poem to that effect. While the religious world continued to cultivate the story of the miracle, the secular Zionist world cultivated the earthly valor, that of warriors and rebels. And there's this underlying conflict that goes again all the way back to the first book of the Maccabees and the second book of the Maccabees. Who should be emphasized here? The Maccabees themselves, or the military victory on one hand, or the miracle of the oil? This is a very fundamental dispute, and perhaps we can say that both are absolutely required. We're looking at a time now when there's a new identity, there's a new concept of what it means to be a Jew. We've been speaking up this idea of this aggressive, muscular, afraid of nothing Jew, who perhaps was personified in the kibbutz movement in previous generations. But nowadays we're focusing more on their ability to, as you see over here, to fight battles and protect the Jewish lives through victory and military prowess. Perhaps we really have to unite both of them, as this picture that you see in front of you personifies. Hanukkah is a multifaceted Yom Tov. It is about both of those things, and we need both of those things in order to ensure that the other does not completely go away. We need to be rooted in our understanding, our concept of godliness and the relationship that we have with Hashem that will enable our nation, it will enable the state of Israel to continue its national destiny in light and goodness. And we also have to have that same military prowess, protect and ensure that the state of Israel continues and is able to exist to facilitate people being able to light Hanukkah menorahs, as you see here, study Torah, and keep mitzvos. So again, Hanukkah has had a long journey. It's been viewed through many different lenses. There's been, at the very base, from the earliest time, a tension between whether or not it is a military celebration or a spiritual celebration. And the conclusion I'd like to come to now is that we need both of them. They can both be true. One does not completely rule out the other. And with that, I am open to questions, comments, and/or rebuttals.